What has happened once will never happen again, and what's happened twice will certainly happen a third time. History, like the bardic song, may not repeat, but it does rhyme, and to this extent the reproduction of the tale, compounding on itself exponentially, is based on the origins of the order of society, which starts with the spoken word and the bardic inspiration in order to lead the culture, as the storytellers are the leaders, and the leaders make their witch doctors, which generate the specialty of the controls, fine-tuning the rest of it towards their premier desire. And to these ends, the manufacture compounds exponentially, and thus the action of each thing in the twisting and rhyming and subverting of words and rhymes and subversions of histories and the tellings and retellings according to the interests, such as the expression of the compounding expansion of each narrative from the bards in the Middle Ages, which then exponentially facilitate the proof positive of said histories, which, as a history, would have been its own twist on things, which had already been a norm, as the function of each culture had already been established when the Romans had conquered the Europeans and established Christianity at the head, and the Catholic Church, engaging in their universal control over everything, absorbed and consumed the rest of it, and then transformed it according to their own ideals. And thus the action of the subversions inside of the church had already existed in the culture and were adapted for the express purposes of being comfortable to those cultures, which were never going to renounce any of these historic traditions, as they are fundamental to their identity, and the acknowledgement of those behaviors being absorbed were known by the leaders of the Romans, who were in many cases disgusted by the rituals and subversions normal to them and the expression thereof, in order to become normalized to these degeneracies, as the higher echelons had manufactured their own acquired tastes, and these particular acquired tastes were a symbol of status, and no one who did not have those statuses were allowed to possess them, as is derived by their agreement from the witch doctors and the witches in their celebration of the priesthood of the Druids and its control over the various governments in its wide migrational array, controlling the stability and destabilizing nature of each of them, and this having in the past historically spread about the normalization of villages as hyper-localized positions which could enjoy the benefits of communism at a hyper-localized level, would then maintain the position of the celebration, which then, when absorbed into the larger whole, then broke apart these particular specific identities, creating traumas inside of them which they would actively desire to rebel against, and to this end maintained the disillusionment of their superior positions into the larger order, as they lost their status to the larger unit when they were absorbed into the whole, forever to dream of times of returning to the noble savageries of village superiority and nobility amongst this position, where the locals held all in common on a word of valor or positive honor derived by their position in society, which could be kept track of with their technology based upon the fact that this is merely just human communication, and thus the connections would then be subverted by these outsiders who begin to manipulate them with these spells and subversions and these magic tricks, as they know that they're being scammed, but many of them can't functionally understand it and have to put an identity to it in order to digest what's going on and put it into a rational concept. And these ideals of causality, such as in Berserker, which would then be expressed, uh, acknowledged by those in control, would see the specifics and craft it to the locals, and thus the function of their own delusion would be compounded upon itself for their own delusion. How they translate the thing becomes their custom, becomes their norm, and thus the exploitation racket exponentially continues, and thus the Druids in control can play the light side and the dark side of each of them as they engage in Hegelian dialectic in order to manufacture the specific control and exploits desired amongst these to be sacrificed cattle people, these prey items to be sacrificed after exploitation, such as the ritual wars, which, engaging the conflicts with each other, would exponentially depopulate them, facilitating the service to the higher deities derived in worship of the centralized authority of the priesthood, which controls all and has every power above the government. Now, when the Middle Ages peoples went to the New World and they discovered all kinds of new things, including new diseases, this is derived by the fact that they are a different functional group, and thus the action of them doing the same in other cultures is them finding new things, and they have complete disbelief in the concept of the diversity of the potential of life and what it would do, such as those who went to India and completely did not understand the idea of crocodiles and ignored the warnings about the dangerous dragons inside the swamp. This, of course, was quick to fix itself once they've lost a few, and thus the action of these traumas materialize exponentially and could in the past have been actively subverted upon itself, such as the construct of, let's say, large constricting animals or vampirous poisonous snakes, and thus the action would generate the potential for major broods, which then would generate Hydra-type concepts, which the bards would actively manipulate into its own narrative as the perception of its existence intertwined with the narrative materializes the desirable song, which Socrates understood when he was posturing to the construct that everything should be held in verbal control, and thus when the thing becomes undesirable, as we do not know what things are, when it becomes useless, people can just forget it. It doesn't get reproduced and therefore is quickly forgotten as useless fairy tales. And it, like everything else that dies in nature, is consumed and destroyed and would not be preserved in any way, and thus there would be no concept of a fossil of the thing, as the thing is exclusively to be repeated or to die on its own, and therefore all of the critters would come and devour each part, and consuming the whole of it would not leave so much as a bone, which otherwise would require special care in order for it to be able to survive the exponential periods, and therefore these mass times where most do not have the superior intellect and capacity towards the written language, which would be a mysterious magical spell to any of the outsiders, would not be expressed to them in any particular way, as it's such as in the Middle Ages with the Catholic Church that came after it, would not write the words inside of the local languages, so that they would have to accept whatever the priest is saying, who does have the advantages of the written word, allowing for the infinite exploitation for whatever arbitrary thing is desired, making the Druid priesthood structure generate their local priests to have every particular advantage, which would then generate them as the superstar of the celebrated, and therefore would generate to themselves the natural harems associated with these superior powers, such as the modern day version of the powerful businessman who has affairs with his secretaries because he's rich and he's powerful. And these concepts derive the attraction to the thing, which having always been, would have been exploited as an accepted norm, as a society, would have had to have adjusted to these things as they rearrange and stabilize the tradition. Now, these exponential sciences, having been held with inside this advantage above the common, disconnected in every way from it being historically recordable in any reasonable manner, would by definition reside upon the mythos, which would be known and exploited as an advantage, so any scientific advantages that they would have would be held in tight secrecy upon the common way of sustaining society. And therefore, if the concept that many of the insurrectionists hold to be true in the diversification of their cults and the creation of the CIA's reproduction of cults as an idea, would then maintain the satanic function upon these historic norms, which would be understood and reproduced and translated into their own thing, such as the position of the Jin or the Song dynasties, which historically would be rebranded upon the genie or the bardic inspirations and these types of concepts, which would have been a deeper historical tradition long before then, which then would be imbued to them in the twisting of languages, which then could be explained as nothing more than a fanciful lyric, which then could be easily forgotten, but has, of course, the deeper understanding of itself to be exactly the thing it postures as. Take, for instance, the tales about the various heroes that would come in and save them from the dreaded monsters, which, of course, they would be playing both sides for. They would play the hero and they would play the monster, which would then allow them to have an infinite exploit, such as the collection of silver as a payoff in order to dissolve the werewolf position, allowing them to not get attacked. Similar to in the show the Vikings attacked the English town. The town's king would pay them a tribute in order to have them agree to not attack again. And these types of things would have already been historically normal. The thing is understood. And tradition would exploit the illiterate commoners who would not understand it, who would have to tell and retell their own personalized variant to the distribution, as was dictated by the Druids. To this end, the mechanism of the exploited powers is for those who study the magics, and thus the mechanism of reproducing them, and thus the desire of its reincarnation materializes the active redistribution of the Hindus and other mechanisms which would have been derived, according to their own theories, of the Aryans or the White Supremacists, which, having used the brutal superiority of the exponentially large Northerners, who would then engage in their massive trades and war parties, which then, traversing the entirety of the world, would generate their own particular legends according to the craft of the Druids, personalizing to each of the cultures the same generic thing in order to get them to conform to the exploits specifically desired amongst them, at which point they would not need to do anything. To this end, the mechanism facilitated their secret empire, which requires them to actively support the position of providing hospitality to the arbitrary stranger, which would actively have been traveling through in order to make those exploits, and thus the position of sacrifices, such as the provision of resources on the outside of the house that would be easily accessible, would allow them to engage in these positions of tributes as that same express position of the delivery of the silver in order to not have the conflict. These perpetual availabilities of resources would then feed these Druid overlords and their support forces, who, of course, having their own children and whatnot, would have actively played their own various pranks and whatnot. And to these ends, the mechanisms of these subversions, being placated by the sacrifices, normalizes the stability of the superiority of their class above the commoners, who are most actively illiterate, as they have to pick the predators that they prefer, as the weak do as they must, and the strong do whatever they want. To this end, the mechanism of these exploits normalizes their ability to engage in their Vikings, or travels, or migrations, in order to have normalized their vast network around the world, which would increase the diversity of information that they would have access to, including the diversity of life and of culture and of norms, and refining exponentially the powers of these positions would then materialize into the manifest collective knowledge upon whatever the most traveled and therefore the most experienced would be able to normalize in these positions until broken apart by rebellions or what have you. This then would then normalize the reproduction of the seeding of trade routes, which then would provide such various amenities that they could actively collect on, and therefore the hospitalities normalized upon this would allow them a wider and wider migration level, facilitating the more diverse advantages, which, such as in the modern time, is acknowledged as a benefit of the wealthy to be able to visit luxurious places for exotic benefits and exotic foods, etc., and therefore the mechanism of this trade for those exotic positions would have stabilized those normal positions, allowing them to cede the slaves to be treated normally, that they might, according to this exploitative relationship, provide all of those benefits, forcing the diversity of areas to accept the diverse people groups which then would have been planted by these Aryan superiors, going on their Vikings. Now, the thing is understood as they are functionally pirates, which double as the function of tradesmen, which then materializes the full security of their arrangement in the spread of their commerce, as they travel at night according to their map recorded upon the sky, which then materializes the full capacity of their entanglements into the horoscopes, and thus the various traditions, the true horoscope traditions, which they would have broken apart and diversified upon each of the cultures, which could be then collected on a new Northerners, Vikings, which builds experience and knowledge as they construct their education upon their travels, until they've earned the full status upon the checkpoints, passing each of the classes, or not being allowed to venture to the next. Now you might ask yourself, why did Columbus create such devastating destruction amongst the populations of the Americans if this thing is true? And the answer, of course, is that Columbus, as a massive dickhead, actively engaged in war against them and subverted them and broke upon their agriculture and their ability to sustain themselves, depriving them of nutrients and essential life-giving substances. As their immune systems were stripped, they became exponentially more vulnerable to the diseases provided, which would have otherwise had a much lower kill rate. And to the end that that would generate a lower kill rate would be substantively inferior in the Vikings, who have a cultural position of controlling the system as opposed to any direct dominance, as they are not trying to become the government, they are the priesthood. And when their representative democracy of Druids aren't able to materialize an agreement amongst each other, they engage in a civil war amongst their covert leaders, materializing the position of their secret wars amongst the secret societies which have been bred through a time immemorial. And to these ends, you have the diversifications and separations amongst these groups when their disagreements may not be settled peacefully, which would actively exploit any tensions amongst the locals that they would have been traveling to, as they lead and covertly manufacture additional recruits and violent forces to engage in the art of war against the other, that they, as the superiors, might fight each other to the death, that they might assert dominance amongst the other Druids. Take, for instance, the functions of the exponential increase of the tropical in order to generate the parasitic. To this end, the special unique qualities of a particular parasite might be exploited for every type of advantage, such as the ability to engage in a psychedelic experience. Say, for instance, the ability for this parasite to, like, against some animals, be able to parasitically control the particular animal. Say there was one of those which could control the human body, or a variation of the type. This then would generate those specific advantages by these Vikings, which were historically known to have carved their teeth into sharp points, that they might accentuate the predatory nature of their superiority, as the general publics of each of the villages they transcribe past would actively be their prey and cattle. It would be known as a thing that they would have to go through the various areas which would collect the most diseases from their travels, as the Black Death was derived by the Mongol Empire's trade, so too the same thing might occur amongst another disease which very well could have been eradicated by the time it would have been recorded in other literature, which of course would embed itself inside the local traditions, facilitating the systemic uprising of these particular legends of lore, and thus the mechanism of those advantages from whatever thing it might derive materializes the systematic understanding of the existence of unknown life, whether willing or unwilling, would generate these various alterations, and thus the mechanism, such as the position of seed oils and others creating Alzheimer's disease, generates these types of concepts that we normally, as commoners, would not be able to internalize, especially if they were illiterate in the past, and thus the action of their complete disconnect from any scientific education materializes everything that would be scientifically superior to be understood as magical, mystical, godly, and magic. The exponential research of this as they engage in their Vikings to have actively maintained their ability to control it would then translate it in its various fairy tales, quote unquote, and thus explain the magics of these entities that exist that you cannot see that actively engage in these transversal activities which control the entirety of the environment, which to be an understood, educated thing would have to be translated in these types of ways in order to express it, which then allows for the delusional changes which are expressed in these tales, which would be translations of material events which could have very well been a status quo staple in their existence, which being understood and crafted like all other things inside human society would actively have been maintained, similar to our modern day Dr. Fauci's position of gain of function research, actively maintaining the manipulation of these fairy creatures. Do keep in mind, whenever you need to travel in the modern day, as it is understood, it is important that you study each of the regions you intend on going to in order to get a vaccination, most commonly horse piss. To this end, the mechanism proves itself exponentially upon our modern sciences, which we would otherwise disregard, as it is specifically intended in the elaborate mystery that is designed to be ignored while right in front of you the entire time, such as the position of inbreeding into the education structure or specialty structure the systems of their magic spells in order to limit the potential of the locals that they might not engage in an uprising of knowledge and therefore break the bands of the superiority of the competencies between them and the Vikings. To this end, the mechanism would generate that position, and therefore many of them say that the thing is impossible when in fact it is very possible, and that the secret of it supposed to being the thing that gives the leverage to the Vikings materializes the disguise that it would have been a cultural norm to have ignored it and therefore normally been dissolved as a problem until the mass distribution is broken by their scientists, which then, acting independent to the structure assigned to them, materializes their ability to expand exponentially beyond the classifications and then normalized it as information common to the public-ish. Take, for instance, the mechanism of the assigned hero and villain archetype, which then materializes the damsel in distress or the sacrificed woman or any of the other historic norms to the fairy tales, materializes the position of the ability to collect and distributing to the traveling Vikings their various advantages, and therefore the normalized structured play materializes their ability to take as thou wilt with the perfect acceptance and celebration of the common folk who would have normalized said sacrifice, and to the ends that it serves generates their ability to have taken the slaves with them without harming them, and thus exploited them for all of the normal advantages that they would have sought, including the position of the damsel in distress being an exponentially beautiful princess to be held in a locked away tower, etc., what have you, materializes the position of them having specialized their taste and having ordered the specific thing in detail, and therefore the subject of them being consumed by the quote unquote dragon is little more than the Vikings having engaged in a mail order bride and then just taken her with them on his travels, with all of the normals, fetishes, and desires from its various mechanisms that would fundamentally entail, including the status quo normalization of pedophilia amongst the locals historically, as the function of reproduction is a highly controversial position in a time of high death rates, including of birth deaths, and therefore the infertility derived by the natural traumas of life of people not knowing things, including the consumption of alcohol, which is a status quo norm amongst many of them in order to have purified the ability to drink, would then have actively polluted the pregnancy. These types of problems exponentially compounding on itself increases the acceptance of that norm, and therefore the damsel being too young, being held there for years, is explained in many ways and modernized and subverted in its various components, but fundamentally would basically mean the same thing, except for it would then have matured into an acceptable version, which would amount to the same experience, and depending upon what the thing was specifically ordered for, would have various advantages. Now, this would actively entail an entirely actively understood market amongst those groups, which then materializes the position of the specialty and uniqueness of each of the particular groups and lineages and blah, 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 for the various interests amongst those who are trading in the priesthood and engaging in that brokerage, which would then materialize all of the specific narratives which would arise in all of our celebrated myth. This, of course, compounded with the secret sciences which would be derived amongst the literate against the illiterate, would exponentially compound their ability to have gone and enough of these Vikings in order to have built the various technologies essential to these constructs, such as the mythical position of the ship that is able to direct itself, or of the ability to engage in a steamship at all, and thus the action of being able to have a self-propelled ship that knows exactly where it's going with its own navigation system, historically understood in time before time. These types of technologies may or may not have existed or have a diverse advantages, such as the position of the creation of a submarine, which then they could relabel as a salmon, or the function of a helicopter, or the function of a jet, which then would be able to be explained as a dragon, with skin as hard as steel, which could not be pierced by the most noble of knights, as their virtue is inadequacy to the trauma inherent to the superiority of this unchallengeable beast, which spits fire from its nostrils, consuming all that would oppose it, as they exterminate in an explosion upon the contact of this breath, which reaches at a rate exponentially beyond the normal speed of any fire that they locally would have been able to have perceived, and thus have to have subjugated themselves to any who has access to such magnificent power. Dwelling inside of the beast, they themselves being an inferior thing, are understood to have been the thing itself, as though they could have entered it and become a part of its brain, like some kind of Power Rangers arrangement. But what on God's green earth in the BCs would they be able to explain that as? But this system not being a mechanism of war or of a collective empire, quote unquote, would be derived more specifically of localized knowledge and specialties generated from its distribution from a larger, wider area, which would then engage in a sub-Vikings or a migration pattern, which would then allow them to collect all of the parts, creating their own machine, which would then make them the head beast, etc. And therefore, the Druids being able to transform into the more luxurious higher powers would specifically be derived by their specific status in the priesthood. Now, this control over the story, and therefore the public narrative, and thus the expression, the superiority of information by literature, as it is historically understood, You don't know how to read, you don't know how to take directions by commonly acceptable signs, you don't know how to order things. Like a special comedian for Parks and Recreation's most mischievous nephew that would be absolutely dumbfounded about an entire trip to Red Lobster, which otherwise would have been absolutely delightful, but twist of fate could be the most horrendous event ever, as they wouldn't even know how to order garlic bread. And to wit, it is understood that this being the desire of the Confederate insurrectionists engaged in their Druid civil war in order to purge the function of all of the advantages of civilized society, materializes the compulsion to illiteracy, as they are allergic to the common education, which they would actively dismantle in favor of these superior advantages that any of the locals would disbelieve what would actually be happening, even if it was explained to them perfectly, and thus the mechanism of them being demoralized and delusional are fully subject to the permanent exploits and injuries arbitrarily desired for them by their abusers. Here, today, in the United States, the West, and the world, would then materialize the function of reproduction of this by the mass degrowth of the entirety of the world, by those mechanisms, by all of the powers derived by the concentration of the centralized powers, which would then hyper decentralize back into these traumatized ancient times of legend and lore, making your poverty complete. In their satanic abuses, they materialize as the hyper-decentralization of power in favor of the clan to be controlled by the new Vikings as the marauders, materializing the function of the active travelers, enforcing their hate crimes for their Druid superiority, which then materializes all of the traumas historically understood, which we fought so hard to get away from, lost from our own stupidity and depravity, that they might be ruled by the Druids, who have manufactured themselves to be fashioned in the likeness of gods who hide inside of the mountain, and thus the mechanism of all of the secret bases which could exponentially survive any of the traumas, being able to use all of the secret technologies against the general public as they fantasize mythologically their ancestors have done in time immemorial, before the antediluvian time. As the function of life is cycles, and the function of the cycles are the repeating of those rhymes as they lyrically inform the rest of growth and degrowth, ascension and descension, and the function of the exponential destruction and eradication of common access to the hyperacceleration of knowledge, which had historically already been known, therefore the historic rhythm being derived by their ability to prophesy from their active enforcements would have standardized those norms and predicted the side effects, giving them a godly superiority to the outcomes of various particular groups, and therefore be able to maximize the privileges of all of the diverse scams which had historically been normalized, and thus their mass ingestion of this knowledge and breaking down of society allows them to apply these exploits maliciously for all time immemorial, repeating these processes infinitely, like a Final Fantasy series, which actively applies to the same planet eons separated from each other, derived by the same cyclical system of human life and its existence on this miserable planet, overseen by the superior ancient powers, parasitically traumatizing them. To wit, the end of the materialized scams normalizes the function of the communist position of sharing the words without the definitions, having a thieves' cant secret definition for the thing, as they engage in the magical exchange of the subversion of words in their agreement to that arrangement, at which point the only law is that there are no laws. The only agreement is that do as thou wilt is the whole of the law, and therefore the mechanism materializes the magical spell of subjugating everyone to everyone's will as they engage in the crushing mechanisms of the monkey's paw, subjugating the entirety of each controlled cell with the arbitrary abuses and whims of the others as the excess is taken desirably from those traveling through as the superior druids, collecting nonsensically anything that they would have randomly needed, and therefore having thoroughly distracted the smucks would then materialize the function of their permanent, intentional, self-restraining slavery derived by their own inherent, permanent genetic inferiority. According to the arbitrary arrangements and normalizations and customs derived by the Druid religious function, to this end materializes the theocracy oppressing them, which is, of course, self-inflicted, or the random desire and greed specifically generated for the outcome of any arbitrary, random, misdirected presumption of an advantage, which of course would always be non-substantive, as the entirety of their advantages is lip service without substance. They, as all others, would be discovered upon maturity as being utterly fruitless and pointless, and therefore, having used it in the first place, was nothing but a self-destructive practice and an exercise of futility, which is the traumatized reality and existence and experience of every half-wit fuck-up who would ever support them or their systems, which was obviously condemned in the Christian Bible amongst others, which, having discovered the scams of their various executions, would have been rejected wholesale as a genetic inferiority or intellectual inferiority, requiring the purges of these defects would have actively been applied if they did not provide a degree of self-sufficiency separated from those mechanisms, which would be entirely self-destructive amongst the practicing which quote unquote practices everything that God hates. And if you specifically look in the Bible of everything God hates, you know the entirety of what these degenerates prefer.